All right, let's go ahead and get started. So I'm Joe Maglioka. I'm a tutor at the ILC. I tutor chemistry, biology, and some math. But today we're going to talk about critical thinking and problem solving. And I'm going to go over some definitions of critical thinking. I'm going to go over a couple different examples of problems and talk about those. And then we're going to do an activity that shows us how critical thinking could be used in real life. So we'll start with, what is critical thinking? So, a good place. What do you think critical thinking is? Anybody have a definition? You can type it in the chat or you can say it out loud.
Joe, when I think of critical thinking, I think about really analyzing something that a thought, really analyzing a thought and just breaking it down or just looking at it on many levels.
Great, yeah, that's a good example. So yeah, it's a good way of looking at these different levels. Anybody else have definitions? Anybody? Well, oh, here, Zion, MEL's typing something. Let Zion type the answer. But yes, that's a good way to look at it. It'll look at different levels, look at, just a minute. Thinking about information given to you and thinking about what it means. Yeah, that's a good way. That's a good part of it. One thing you'll find is there's a lot of different definitions of it. It can be defined in several different ways. And it's like none of the definitions are wrong, but they all kind of cover different aspects of critical thinking. So I'm going to look at a couple popular definitions of critical thinking to start. So Wiktionary, that website says that critical thinking is the application of logical principles, rigorous standards of evidence, and careful reasoning to the analysis and discussion of claims, beliefs, and issues, that kind of thing. Dictionary.com defines it as disciplined thinking that is clear, rational, open-minded, and informed by evidence. And the Foundation of Critical Thinking, which is an organization that promotes critical thinking education, defines it as self-guided, self-disciplined thinking that attempts to reason at the highest level of quality in a fair-minded way. So there's all these different definitions, but what does it mean in an academic setting? Because that's what's most important to us. So generally, in a classroom, critical thinking refers to problems and projects that incorporate multiple concepts and ideas. So rather than following like a simple formula or a simple recitation of facts, just repeating, just regurgitating the information that you learned, critical thinking problems and activities require combinations of these. Instead of learning facts, it's kind of learning to use the facts. And then you use these to make like a complex strategy that can help you solve the problem or project or whatever. So in general, critical thinking problems, which you'll see in all sorts of different types of classes, will lead you to seeing a bigger picture perspective of a concept. They can exist kind of on a spectrum ranging from simple to complex. So it's not like a question is critical thinking or it's not necessarily. But it has how do I want to say this? It it's like as these problems get more complicated, you have more and more critical thinking in them. So you can have a question that has a little bit of critical thinking. You can have one that has barely any critical thinking. You can have some with a lot of critical thinking. It just depends on what the question is. And they're important. The reason educators like to get students to learn these is because these are the type of problems that you'll face in the real world. You're very unlikely to have a life or death situation where you have to do a simple arithmetic problem. But it's much more likely that you might have a life or death situation that requires, several different types of math problems. Several different kinds of math concepts that feed into each other. Or math and science and English sometimes. So moving on, how do we think critically? So one thing is, for critical thinking, there isn't really a formula. There isn't like, okay, we're going to do this, we're going to think critically. And for any type of critical thinking problem, you aren't going to just see these problems. It's not just a formula or a one-size-fits-all approach, but there are some strategies that work in multiple situations, and that's kind of what you want to, at least where you want to start with these. So some good strategies is ask questions about the question, or ask questions about the situation. Revisit questions. Depending on the answers to other questions, you might want to get more information or change a little, change your other questions, get more information about other questions, and so on. And revise and update these questions or answers as you learn more. Be prepared for disruptions or wrong conclusions. A lot of these types of problems, you might interpret them one way and start going down one path, or follow one set of steps, one set of strategies to solve it, and then you realize that won't work and you may have to start over. But you can still have learned things from your wrong attempts. But that's one of the keys to where a lot of people get frustrated. And always, as much as possible, separate emotion from reason. One of our tutor coordinators says that that's difficult to do as humans, and maybe it's probably impossible to do completely, because we aren't thinking machines that feel, we're feeling machines that can think. But try to do that as much as possible. All right, well, let's move on now to talking about critical thinking in specific classes, or specific types of classes at least, because different, critical thinking questions will look different in different classes and they'll require different strategies. So mathematical word problems require critical thinking. They pretty much all require critical thinking strategies. Even the simplest word problems will require more critical thinking than symbol-based math problems. So for example, if you were just doing 3 plus 7, once you memorized how to add, you could just plug in 7, that's it. But even a simple word problem that would require the same mathematical operation, like John has 3 apples and Mary has 4 apples, how many apples do they have altogether? That's certainly a very simple word problem, but it requires some more critical thinking, because it still involves a story, and it still involves, it's like we have a little story. We still have to pick out the mathematical information from that, and then figure out what mathematical application or operation would be helpful in that situation. So even a simple word problem has more critical thinking. But as you go on, of course, you get more and more, as the situations get more complex and you have to incorporate more mathematical techniques, it gets more and more complicated and requires more and more critical thinking. A couple other things about critical thinking in math problems is sometimes there's more than one correct solution. And even when there is one solution, there's often more than one pathway you can take to get to the solution. I kind of use this solving a Rubik's Cube analogy for this. So, to solve a Rubik's Cube, you want all the stickers of one color to be facing on each side of the cube. And usually there's more than, and so there's really only one solution, one possible arrangement of those squares with the right colored sticker. But the steps you take to get to the solve position oftentimes can be done in different orders. So as long as you do the correct step, you can solve them in different orders. And so I sometimes use that analogy with math problems. There's often more than one way to solve them. And that, I've noticed, throws a lot of people. They're like, what is the correct way? And so when I tutor students, I sometimes have to say, well, focus on one way, and then usually I try to have them lead that. And then I might mention, you could also do it this way. Oftentimes, and so there really isn't a better way to do it a lot of times. Sometimes one is faster than the other, but it's also easier to make a mistake. So it depends on what the student's preference is. And related to this, what I mentioned earlier is with these kind of word problems, a good strategy is to try to categorize them. So like if you've seen several word problems, you try to categorize them into different types of word problems. And then, even though it's not usually as simple as just plugging into a formula, there's still, you can kind of develop a protocol, like a set of strategies and steps you can take. And so that's a good strategy for math critical thinking, is look at, okay, what big topics is it asking about? So let's give an example of a word problem. I'll give you an example of an algebra word problem, a relatively simple one. I made it up, so it took me a little longer to work it out so that the numbers actually worked. But it's still overall a fairly simple word problem. And we'll look at critical thinking skills. We'll look at the critical thinking skills that we have to use to solve it. So imagine there's a class trip and 400 students have to go to a museum. Some of the students are going to pay the regular price of $30, and some will get a discount and only pay $20. If overall the trip costs $10,000, how many students will get the discounted price of $20? So what are some steps? Well, a good place to start would be, I know some of you might be panicking when you see this, some of you might think it's easy. But we're not gonna, the key isn't to solve this, it's to look at how we solve this. So read and carefully reread. And when we do that, we can pick out the important information. We know there's a total of 400 students. We know tickets cost $30 or $20. And we know that in total, $10,000 was paid. So we can write this in mathematical terms, which would be algebraic terms in this case. So I'm sorry, my handwriting is messy no matter what. And on this little tablet I'm writing on, it's even worse. But if we say R equals number of students paying regular price, and I'll use lowercase r actually for that. And D equals number of students. Does everybody see what I'm writing, by the way?
Yeah.
Yes.
Some
Yeah.
students, sometimes people don't. I'm not sure why. Okay, does anybody not see what I'm writing? Good. Maybe Teams fix that. We can say, what do we know based on that information? Well, we know there's 400 students total, so we can say R plus D equals 400. Oops, I need 4,000. And we know that they paid 30 times R plus 20 times D equals 10,000. And then, sorry, it's kind of hard to see there, but then we can use techniques. Okay, knowing this much, what techniques can we use to solve it? So this would be a systems of equations problem. And so we would use systems of equation strategies to solve it. So you might remember elimination and add them. And we're not really, solving, like I said, isn't the problem, but that's how we would, isn't the purpose of this exercise, but that's how we would do that. And in case you're wondering, R and D are both 200, in case you're wondering how to solve it. So it ends up being the same number for each. But that's kind of math and how critical thinking in math works. And obviously you could have math problems that require more or less, but that's just one way to get you thinking about it. So let's move on now to talking about critical thinking in English and history classes. So these frequently involve critical thinking because you often are asked to compare events or discuss events rather than just describe them. And I lumped English and history together because you see this with both like analysis of novels and short stories and that kind of thing, and analysis of literature and analyses of historical events. So you might have different, so you'll ask different things about it. You might have an opinion-based question, like what do you think of what happened in this story, or what do you think about what happened in this war? Or it might be about events something we talked about in class, like we discussed this in class. What did you think? That kind of thing. Sometimes you'll have things where you have to look at a big picture perspective, like how did a particular event fit into the whole story, or that kind of thing. Or also you might have to analyze other people's views or interpretations of the events. So it's like so and so says this about this novel story. Do you agree or disagree? Why or why not? So the key is kind of, and then use what you know about what happened in the novel or short story or in the historical event to say whether you agree, disagree, or whatever with this other person's view or opinion. So I'm going to use a historical event and show you questions with different levels of critical thinking skills. And notice that these not only do they have require different levels of critical thinking skills, they can kind of build on each other. Because on a history test in particular, you might see all three of these in different sections of the test. So a simple fact-based question might be, what U.S. Civil War battle took place July 1st to July 3rd, 1863? Battle of Gettysburg, in case you're wondering. And that's just a simple recitation of facts, which is part of history. But it doesn't require a lot of critical thinking. This question requires a little more. How did the Battle of Gettysburg affect the course of the U.S. Civil War? Did it, how did it change? Like how were things before? How are things after? That kind of thing. And so again, you'd have to use other facts that you've learned or other historical events you've learned about. And you might have like a bigger question. This is one that kind of involves other people's views. It's a pretty common view, but the Battle of Gettysburg is often said to be the turning point of the U.S. Civil War. But less than 2 weeks later, 2 weeks after the battle, the New York City draft riots occurred. And as much as a year later, Abraham Lincoln seriously feared losing re-election. So knowing this and other events, do you agree that it was the turning point of the war? Why or why not? So that's more of a prompt for an essay. But as you see, it's an essay based on other people's, a common view. And so you're saying, do you agree or do you disagree? So that requires a lot more critical thinking. And that thinking about how these events play into your discussion of this topic is a critical thinking. That's an example of critical thinking. All right. And next, we will move on to talking about critical thinking in a science class. Science classes, I should say. So science problems build on your previous knowledge pretty much all the time. So you're almost always going to have some level of critical thinking. But obviously you have some simple science questions and more complex and abstract science questions. And so like math problems, the simpler science problems will often involve just a relative description of facts, although it's usually a little more complicated than in math or English or history. And you might have one that's a relatively simple description of facts, but you'll also have problems where you have to combine multiple techniques in order to solve it, or multiple concepts. It almost, like, by its nature, science requires discussing things from a big picture perspective. You kind of have to learn to see the forest for the trees, if you know that expression. You have to learn details, but you really have them. It's really important to see how those details fit together. So here's a couple similar science questions using different levels of critical thinking. So, and they also are all kind of related questions that build on each other, or can build on each other at least. So a relatively simple question is, what are the properties that define something as living? I'm using biology questions because biology is it's a lot more text-based than chemistry, and way more text-based than physics. So if we have a question, what are the properties that define something as living? So that's kind of a list of facts that you've learned. But we can go into a little more detail with a question like, so you can list the properties of a living thing. Well, what is an example of a non-living thing that has one of each of the properties that define life? So if you look at the properties that define life, a lot of things that are clearly non-living will have at least one of those properties, but a living thing is supposed to have all of those properties. And then, so they want examples of that. And then if we go on to even more complicated, we could ask, why are viruses said to be on the edge of living and non-living? What properties of life do they share with living things, and what properties do they lack? So again, this is kind of asking you to discuss, what someone else's opinion, or even if it's a common one, and asking you to use different facts to kind of look at it in these different, to look at it for a more complicated question. So you're using multiple facts to solve, to figure out another fact or opinion or that kind of thing. All right, so let's move on to talk a little about critical thinking in real life, because a lot of what we've talked about so far has been kind of dry. It's talking about, it's kind of by its nature, talking about how to solve classroom problems is, well, some people can find that very interesting, but I know a lot of people won't find it as interesting. So moving on for that, but I guess now we'll talk a little bit more about the real life and why we have to do all those complex problems. And the main reason is because the problems you're going to encounter in real life are much more likely to require at least some critical thinking skills. And honestly, a lot of those real life problems are going to be even more abstract and more complicated than what you learn in a classroom. Even the more complicated than the ones that are supposed to be complicated, because real life isn't really neatly divided into subjects and classes. So the real world problems are often going to require you to draw on knowledge from many different sources. And so, like I was saying earlier, these critical thinking classroom activities are still simpler than real life ones because they usually will have a relative, if not a correct answer, an answer that the instructor wants you to get to. But in real life situations, there's often multiple correct solutions, and there's often really no correct solution at all. And so, in many situations, you kind of have to go for the least bad option rather than the best option. But it's like a lot of times your options are every possible course of action could be bad, but you want to pick the one that's the least bad. So, in order to make this a little more interesting and to get you involved and to show why critical thinking is important in real life, even a real life classroom, apart from the teaching, is I came up with this activity. So, what I came up with this activity was um, kind of think about an emergency box. What would we fill it with? So, I used like a first aid kit, but it's like a first aid kit plus, you could think. It has things that aren't directly related to first aid. So imagine we're in a classroom and we're filling a box with emergency supplies for the classroom. The box can be pretty big. I won't be strict with that, but it has to be big enough. It has to be the size where it has to fit into a classroom and be accessible to those who are in a classroom. So, if we had like a massive garage size box that could potentially fit in a classroom, but it'd be pretty hard to grab the things in an emergency. So, what I want you to do is think about emergency situations that we could reasonably encounter in a classroom. And knowing that and knowing what would be useful in those situations, think about what would you put into this box. And then, but after we do that, we'll discuss some classroom emergencies that can really happen and do really happen. And then we'll see which of our items will might be useful in that situation. And we might even add things after the fact. It's like, okay, in this situation we didn't think that we would need this, but maybe we would. So I'll go back and write that in as in like a different color. So that's our little game here. And I guess a little content warning, because some of these are a little disturbing for some people, but I'll say up front, you don't need to worry. There are no active shooter situations that'll be discussed, even though those are certainly emergency situations you'd have to think about in real life. Okay, so everyone, again, you can type it in the chat or you can say it out loud. What would you want to put in this emergency box? Fire blanket, good. Good idea, yeah. Oh yeah, yeah. EpiPen, good. Go wraps or so it could be medical and it could not be medical. Yep, first aid kit, like a whole first aid kit, that kind of thing. Bandages, gauze, that kind of thing. A defibrillator if it'll fit. Duct tape. I only recently learned that it's actually duct tape, except for but although there's some argument over what was actually came first, but yes, but that could be very useful. Burner phone, yep, especially one that can call emergency numbers. Anything else we got? First aid kit. What else might we run into? Gloves, good. Anything else? Mask, good. Smelling salt, maybe that's kind of. Candy for diabetic, good. I was hoping someone would say that. Candy for diabetic. Flashlight, good. Rope, good. Water, good. Batteries, yep. Inhaler, good. What else could we need? I know a couple, but I think I'll save them for later. They'd be useful, but they probably aren't as obvious. Aspirin. Oh, yeah, good. One I didn't think of, so that would be a good one. What else could happen? Canned goods, yep, canned food. Food that won't spoil, basically. Ice pack, yep. Another one I was hoping someone would say. Icy hot, yep. Hopefully somebody's experienced with first aid. Can't really keep a person who's experienced with first aid in here. I was thinking some of these things, it's not easy to use. But most of these are. Anything else? Scissors, yeah, oh, definitely. That's kind of getting at one of the things I was hoping. Good. Well, thank you all for participating. We got a lot more participation this session than last time. Although they were good too, but got more people here too, though. Anything else? Power bank. Yeah, that might be good. Let's see. Anybody else have any ideas? Gauze, yeah, that kind of goes in the first aid kit. They got like rubbing alcohol, band-aids, bandages. Oh yeah, good. Yeah, watch, definitely. You know, a wind-up watch to make sure it stays wound. Good. Anything else? Okay, I think that's good. There was aloe, maybe, yep, for burns. All right. So now let's move on to these real life, or four reasonably real life situations that you might see in a classroom. And if you think of anything else real quick, you could mention it. But also after we talk about them, you might think of a few more things, and I'll add those on. We'll see what we decide to add. Because that's another way of using critical thinking. Yeah, heart attack could happen. So that's why we did the aspirin and the defibrillator. Though you definitely don't want to use a defibrillator if you don't know what you're doing. Could make it much worse. Yeah, burn aloes for burns. All right, let's go on. Okay, so situation one. So we're in a classroom and the fire alarm goes off. We smell smoke immediately and look in the hallway, and we can see that there's fire in our hallway and smoke in our hallway. So which of the items that we put in the box would be useful, and how would we use them? So going back, which of these would be useful in a fire? I know a lot of it depends on exactly where our room is and where the phone to call for help. Good. Fire blanket, yeah, especially if it's a smaller fire. Um, Other things. Ice pack, maybe. Yeah, especially if somebody got burned. Let's see. The mask, yeah, might help with smoke. Extinguisher, that's something we could have used that we didn't put on here. We could have fit. So I'm going to put that in red. Fire extinguisher. And that's one way you can, after one emergency, you can learn what, you might realize you didn't have something you could have used after one emergency. So then you can have that in there for next time. That water might be able to put it out. Towel, maybe, yep. Like put under the door or something. If we're on the second floor, the rope might be used to help us climb down. There's also these rope ladders that can hold a lot of weight and they fold up really well. So if there's a rope ladder, that's another thing we could have used. Anything else? One thing that I was thinking of earlier, that might be useful depending on how big the windows are and how wide they open, is like a toolkit with like a hammer. So we could use that to break open the window if we needed to. Okay, anything else? All right, let's move on to scenario 2. So in the middle of class, and I've had this kind of thing happen before, in the middle of class, a student begins to feel sick and she suddenly collapses at her desk. Another student thinks she said she was diabetic, and this appears to be confirmed. We notice she has a glucometer. So what do we do? And that kind of thing. How can we use that? So which of what we put in the box would be useful here? So the water towel might, oh wait, that was before. So smelling salts, maybe. I'm not sure you're supposed to use them in that situation, but might be. Candy, yep. I was going to say, yep. Candy. They also have these easy dissolving tablets at like Walgreens that are just glucose that you put them on their tongue and they'll dissolve. So that's something. The glucometer, we mentioned the glucometer, but that might be something to actually keep in there. Yep, juice. That didn't come out very well. We might use a glucometer if we didn't know if our blood sugar was too high or too low. We could use the glucometer to figure out. Water might, food, yeah, other food like crackers and peanut butter are good for this. Yeah, but peanut butter. I kind of put that in like the foods that won't spoil, but that's a good thing. I thought about insulin itself, but insulin needs to be refrigerated, so I don't think we can get there. Yep, that's a good thing. Yep, that's, that would be like a glucometer, have one of our own. Gloves, the gloves would be useful here, especially if we're taking someone else's blood. Anything else? Juice, we said juice now. I had a student, we had a student have this happen at Health Science Campus, and unfortunately it's right near the cafeteria at Wake Med Hospital. So I ran over and got yogurt, crackers, and like orange juice or apple juice. Yep, phone for 911. That's another thing. If they're still unresponsive, we may have to call 911. It's another thing. Well, that's good. Okay, anything else? All right, let's move on to critical thinking scenario 3. So on a stormy afternoon, we all received text messages from the school emergency notification system saying that our area is under a tornado warning. And then immediately after we receive that, power goes out. So what do we do? So go back. Yep, flashlight would be useful here. What else? Water and food, yeah, depending on how long we're stuck there. This is when someone suggested last time. Yeah, radio. That's something I was gonna say. That was something I was hoping someone would say. But yeah, radios in particular are battery powered, or they now have these hand cranked radios. That could help, especially if we lost internet access. So radio. And yeah, because it's on your phone, but it's like, yeah, it's if we need if the internet's out. Bandages in case anyone's injured. One thing someone suggested last time is like the fire blanket could be used to help protect us from broken glass. This is where the power bank would come in handy. Yep. And let's see here. The duct tape. That help us with things. I guess to tape up the fire blanket, that kind of thing. The toolkit or whatever, if we had to move stuff out of the way, that might help. Batteries, definitely. Yeah, that's what we're saying. Generator. I don't know if that would fit. That kind of like a power bank is a smaller version of that. Because yeah, I don't know how they'd feel about us running a gas generator in the in a classroom. Let's see here, but the power bank would definitely fit in there. All right, let's see here. Ladder. The rope ladder might potentially be useful if we have to climb around things. So yeah. Peroxide. Oh yeah, and oh something to sterilize injuries or clean wounds, I guess. Let's see here. All right, let's move on to scenario 4 then. So this has happened several times in chemistry classes. During chemistry lab, a student breaks a piece of glassware in his hands, and so a fragment of glass makes a large cut in his thumb, and we notice he's bleeding significantly. What do we do? What do we have now? What would be useful, and what else could we get? So first aid kit, definitely. Bandages and wraps. Something to clean it with. I said alcohol wipes. Yeah, peroxide is another thing. I'll say H2O2. That's hydrogen peroxide. First aid kit, bandages, hydrogen peroxide. Yep. Tweezers might help if we have to pull out broken glass. So I'll put that. Might be in a first aid kit, but I'll put tweezers. Wow, that came out. Flashlight might help. You're right. Magnifying glass might work. Might help. Pain meds. Yeah, aspirin could be used for that. Well, we don't want him to take aspirin if he's bleeding that much. Like Tylenol. Yeah, if it's an emergency. Yep, tweezers. Say acetaminophen. Tweezer knife, yeah. A tourniquet is one thing that hopefully he's not bleeding that much, but we need it. It's there. What else? Is there anything else that might be useful? Skin glue, yeah, that could. Also, our phone or our burner phone or whatever, or somebody's phone to call 911 if it's that bad of a cut. Probably if it's a significant cut, even if we stop the bleeding, they probably have a doctor look at it. I know with glass cuts, they worry a lot about pieces of glass getting in the skin. This is one place I guess the smelling salts might work because, well, sometimes people do pass out around blood, and sometimes if it's bleeding enough, you might just pass out from loss of blood. Although the latter, I don't think you're supposed to use smelling salts, but yeah, disinfection, yeah, that's the kind of thing like triple antibiotic ointment. come out right, but you get the idea. Okay. Anything else? So I think we picked a good set of things. There were some other things we thought of when we found some more possible emergency situations. But so see, we had enough critical thinking skills together to come up with a lot of what we might need. So that was my goal for this activity. It's a little more interesting than just talking about the problems. So, are there any questions before we end? Or comments?
I have a question.
Yeah.
What do you do if you lost at sea?
If you're what?
Like lost at sea. Like
well,
maybe,
that's probably not going to happen for us for our activity, but yeah, that's a situation. Yeah, you got to think about that. You need like GPS and radio communications and stuff. Yeah.
I mean, I guess what I was asking, like, what if the sea level rises? There's a hurricane or something, and the water's not going back down.
Yeah, we'd have to climb up to the top of the building so that our stuff. Like if we're we have to get up to like the roof or something if there's a big flood. But yeah, that would be a different situation. Essentially for 3, that's a possibility. In this situation, there might be floods, even if we miss the hurricane or the tornado.
All right.
Good point. Being out the raft. Yeah, they have those self-inflatable rafts. Got to make sure nobody plays with them. We don't want it to inflate in the middle of class, but yeah, that's a good thing to have if we need it. Right.
I have a question. How can critical thinking not hurt you, but be to your detriment?
That's a good question. Sometimes it can cause you to think too hard about something. So you worry about one situation and you completely don't think about another. So that is actually a good point. You got to have balance in these things. Don't think, it's again, we want to think as big a picture as possible. So we want to think of as many different possible emergencies in our example, at least. But yeah, and then even in the problem, like in a class, the problem, critical thinking problems, you might think too much about one aspect of something you learned and not another. So that is a good point. You kind of want a sense of balance. Yeah, tips for not overthinking. Yeah, that is a good question. And that's something we gotta watch out for.
Thank you.
You're welcome. I've heard, yeah. So, but that's actually an interesting thing too. Tips. That's a good thing. If I give a version of this talk in the future, what would I say about not overthinking? I've heard people say use common sense, which I know seems a little dismissive, but because obviously think of how likely is something going to be. But yeah, that's a good question, and that's a good strategy. Yeah, take your time, take your breath. That's a good thing to think of. All right. Any other questions or comments? Just a minute. All right. Well, thank you for coming. So in the chat, you should have access to the video. And it should pop up within like a few minutes. And so we should be able to get it from there. But thank you all for coming. We're glad there was as much interest as there was in these conferences. And hopefully we'll see you around at the ILC or other places on campus.